Good evening. Thank you for being here. My name is Melissa Long, and I'm a board member of on the Aspen Writers Foundation. Tonight, I want to give a special thanks to Sam and Cheryl Wiley, to the Aspen Times, and to the Aspen Public Radio for helping sponsor our events. We have two wonderful authors here tonight, and we're going to talk about the Great Firewall, which is an enormous topic, with censorship and the monitoring system in China and how it affects writing. I'm going to introduce our two authors, and then we'll start talking. We will take questions for about the last 15 minutes. Yiyun Li, ladies first. Yiyun Li grew up in Beijing and moved here in 1996 to pursue a PhD in immunology at the University of Iowa. In Iowa, she began to write stories of her homeland, told in the language of the nation in which she now lives. Her first collection, 1,000 Years of Good Prayers, was published in 2005 and won a slew of accolades, including the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award and the Guardian First Book Award. Her acclaimed novel, The Vagrants, was set in late 1970s China, and then she's been selected by Granta as one of the 21 best young American novelists under 35. She's been named by The New Yorker as one of the top 20 writers under 40. Her latest story collection is entitled Gold Boy, Emerald Girl. She's a contributing editor to A Public Space and has been named a MacArthur Fellow in 2010, correct?
Yes.
She's living in Oakland and teaching at UC Davis. And I had the pleasure of first meeting Yiyun 6 years ago, I believe.
I think so, a long time ago. Yeah.
I know. At the Hong Kong International Literary Festival. So I was delighted that she was able to attend, and welcome to Aspen.
Thank you very much for having me.
And James Fallows probably also needs no introduction. James is based in Washington and has been a national correspondent of the Atlantic Monthly, where he's worked for nearly 30 years. And has written on a wide range of topics. I'm sure you've read many of them, including national security policy, American politics, the development and impact of technology, economic trends and patterns, and U.S. relations with the Middle East, Asia, and other parts of the world. He's received his undergraduate degree in American history and literature from Harvard and went on as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, where he got a graduate degree in economics. In addition to working for The Atlantic, he spent 2 years as chief White House speechwriter for Jimmy Carter, 2 years as the editor of U.S. News and World Report, and 6 months as a program designer at Microsoft. And he's a pilot. I mean, he's just amazing. James has been a finalist for the National Magazine Award 5 times. He's won the American Book Award for nonfiction. And what is that, a New York Emmy Award?
Yes,
a New York
it's
Emmy
for
Award.
Documentaries. It's not like the real Emmys, but it's the New York Emmys, so it's the best we could do.
And he won that for doing business in China. I have to say, his latest book, China Airborne, is out. And if you haven't read it, it's a fascinating discussion on the aviation industry in China. So welcome to you both. I think what we're going to do today is start a little bit broad and then kind of narrow down. So James, I'm going to ask you if you will describe the 2 pillars of control that exist to monitor and censor the internet in China.
So we're speaking of like the Great Firewall and the Golden Shield.
Exactly.
I will be happy to answer those. I'll give a 15-second prelude first. One of the apart from the prelude of being so happy to be here, and it's a great honor, and Deb and I have been having a great time. One of the things that's been most fascinating to me over the years in trying to describe China is the way that any particular angle you pursue can sort of lead you to larger descriptions of how things work there, whether it's language, as Deb has written about, or tech ambitions, as I've been writing about, and communications control is one of those. And so I think the internet control operations are more important than you might think, because I think they're connected to some of the largest questions of China's potential and development. So operationally, there are 2 sort of connected ways in which online communications are monitored. One is there's what's generically called the Great Firewall. That's not its official name, as you might guess from the government, but it's the name for an informal and evolving system of controls whose effect you'll notice if you're in any place in China and you try to use the internet and suddenly there's places you can't go. The technical reason this is possible in China is there are only about 3 places, now 4 places, where cables come into the country from the rest of the world. Now, the internet in the US was designed to be massively adaptable. It was designed to withstand a nuclear attack, and so it had no center. It was dispersed nodes. The internet for China was designed to be controllable. So there's one site near Beijing where cable comes in, one near Shanghai, one down near Hong Kong, and there's an overland one that started to come in via Russia, but it can be controlled. And without going into all the details, there are automatic censoring mechanisms, there are other sort of filters, and one of the things that makes it so powerful is that you never know exactly what's happening. You just know that you can't get someplace. The connection browns out, you don't know if the site's down, you don't know what the censoring tools are. So the Great Firewall works that way. Golden Shield is more the official government term for this hygienic effort to protect the communication patterns in China against unwholesome influences. There's a quite thorough and effective propaganda strategy by the government that the internet is a basically dangerous, unwholesome, and pitfall-filled area where people need protection. The government is protecting them. You'll see stories about internet addiction and blah, blah, blah. So structurally, that's how things work. The reason I think this is so important is that if you have the main communications tool of this era being hampered and sort of lobotomized and kept at a slow boil, it does raise larger questions about how Chinese universities, Chinese high-end innovators, et cetera, whether they are at some kind of handicap relative to the rest of the world. But that's my initial answer.
It's a huge topic. Well, going back a little bit, when the internet first came into China, I know Bill Clinton was famous for his quote that the internet in China would be like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. And the hope was, or the idea was, that it would erode China's authoritarian state. Do you think that the internet has done that? Are we seeing an effort to democratize China, or is it more authoritarian?
It's really a fascinating question, and I think you can see sort of three time-specific layers of how people have talked about this. 10 years ago, I bet if you had any gathering here, whether it was this festival or an Aspen Tech Festival, or if you went any place in California, people would say, oh, the internet is going to just blow up the Chinese Communist Party. There's no way they can control it. And there was a sort of naive, Panglossian internet communication determinism, which now looks quite naive, because stage two, the government found that it was able to be in the constant race between the people who wanted to make connections and be subversive and the government. The government was better than you'd think in being able to sort of keep ahead of things. While you can't close everything down, you can sort of, the government does a better job at this cat and mouse game than you would think. I'll give just one illustration. We were in Beijing 2 years ago at the time of the Arab Spring demonstrations, and there was this nascent Jasmine Spring movement across China. And so one Sunday, there were demonstrations all across a number of cities, small demonstrations, but they were there. And so the idea was the next Sunday, there were going to be bigger demonstrations. So we were out there the next Sunday in Beijing. Number one, there were more reporters than there were Chinese demonstrators. But number two, within about a mile of this zone, your cell phone didn't work. You couldn't do any instant messages. There was this very effective jamming technique. And so that's this current stage. For the future, I really don't know. Theoretically, you'd think censorship can't keep ahead permanently, but it's been more. Wouldn't you think it's more effective than you would have guessed 10 years ago?
I would say yes. When I came to this country, I thought, there was no way for the government to stop the information to go into the country. When my parents first came to America, the first time they came in 1998, they were so elated because they could see all these Chinese websites in America that they could not see in China. So they would read up this history and all these things. And when they went back, of course, these websites were blocked, but they were able to get over the wall with my husband's help, who is a tech person. But still, I just realized, it's getting faster. I mean, now they don't get access to anything that they want to read.
And so I'm going to hog the microphone for one more minute here, because there's an interesting trend just in the last year or two. Do all of you know here what a VPN is, a virtual private network? This is a way, essentially, you can get around whatever is the internet connection where you are. And the local networks think you are someplace else. And so when we were living in China from 2006 through late 2009, all the foreigners there, and any Chinese who really cared would buy a VPN service. And for $10 or $20 a month, it's like the firewall didn't exist. You could set up your computer to pretend you were in Los Angeles or London or whatever, and it was fine. And just in the last year or two, they've started turning off the VPNs, the Chinese government has, which is really a drastic step, because then universities can't operate and all the rest.
Yes, and also I realized my parents' access also depends on the time of this or the season. If there's a national conference or national congress meeting, everything was turned off for them. So it's very interesting the way it's controlled.
I think that's one thing both of you are bringing up, that, and James, I believe you wrote about this sort of the effective aspect of the Golden Shield is just that, it's unpredictability. Speak a little bit more to that and how much creativity might be lost as people try and get around all these VPNs and proxies.
And also engendered, too.
Yes. I have been enjoying watching the Chinese online communities and how smart they are. If there's one word that is banned, right away there's another word replacing it. Within a minute, replacing it. And there's again, it's mouse. Mouse is running too. These mice are going everywhere, and I find that very fascinating because, for me, what's interesting is the development of the language. The Chinese I see online today is not the Chinese I used when I left China, because it was because of the internet. I think people invented all these language either just to create more communications, also just to escape all this censorship. And I like that there's the sense of humor with all these all kind of cursing words, all variation of cursing words. It's very interesting.
And you can tell them the story about May 35th, and also the
Tiananmen Square massacre was it's always a banned thing, and so June 4th is a banned term, but so now it's May 35th. May 35th, and there are all sorts of ways to get around it, and there's no way to stop it. And I actually think my people are very inventive in that way.
Well, there is this question about whether this systematic censorship can crush creativity. But as I've read more, it seems like the inventions and the innovations to get around and find loopholes are really telling.
Yes, the big yellow duck.
Yes.
I don't know if you have seen the news, the big yellow duck. Because of the Tiananmen Square, every year around June 4th, it's a big thing in China. The government has to make sure nobody protests on the fact that it's the anniversary of Tiananmen massacre, and the man who stood in front of the tank, those forbidden images. So this year, I think they replaced it with a big yellow toy duck.
Which was in Hong Kong.
It was in a huge duck, and everybody has this duck image, and everybody loved it.
And it was initially in Hong Kong sort of as an art thing, and then one of the discussions was whether or not it was copying, or whether it was effective, politicization, which kind of gets into piracy. So I have a question for you, Yiyun. With piracy, I don't believe any of your works have been translated into Chinese. Is that correct? Officially.
I would say, I just give permission for one story to be translated into Chinese last year. I think that's the only official translation I have had.
Okay.
But unofficially, I know there are a bunch of translations on the internet.
Yes, and one of the questions I have, generally we look at piracy and sort of scowl, and yet it is the way of the world. And so what do you think about piracy and being put up there when that's the only access some people could have to your work?
I have conflicted feeling because I benefited, greatly from piracy, of course. I grew up in the 1980s, and there was the bookstore near our house. It's called, Beijing Foreign Language Bookstore. And there was this room that says, foreigners are not allowed to enter. And so only Chinese people could enter. And I would go in, and there were all these pirated Reader's Digests. I promise I have read more volumes of Reader's Digest than anybody in the world. I mean, just volumes, just to learn English and just to know about America. I'm sure it's a wrong America I've learned about, but also just pirated novels from. I read a whole completely photocopied Gone with the Wind. Again, that's my education. So I feel that I benefited from reading those pirated work. On the other hand, my concern about my work being translated without my permission is I think there's mistranslation. And if it's Chinese translation, my view is I have to give the final permission. And oftentimes they don't get what I mean, I think, and I get a little upset.
Mm-hmm. Well, and translation is a huge issue.
Yes.
Most books that are translated into Chinese, you both well know, are significantly altered.
Yes.
And I know you balked at the word fluffiness describing clouds.
Yes, that's as an example. I think one online community translated a story of mine and said, the white fluffy cloud. And if you know my writing, I would never say the white fluffy cloud because I'm not a writer who would use that white fluffy language. So I got a little upset about that. Again, it's you want to get your meanings across, really, really exactly. And translation, a pirated translation, that you cannot control that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think both of these things we've been talking about, control of communications and piracy intellectual property regimes, they're very interesting symbols of China's transition moment, that until now, they've been very useful tools for China. They were able to ingest all this information, and the U.S. in the mid-1800s was doing the same thing. Charles Dickens famously bellyached about all the pirated translations of his books, translations he saw when he came here in the 1840s. And also the controlled media have been very useful to China until this point. But as China tries to create its own homegrown world-class novelists and high-class companies and great universities, both of those suddenly have become limitations for it.
I think it's Murong, speaking of Dickens, who posts a lot of his chapters on the internet. And he said he went on vacation for about a week and came back, and somebody else had done chapter 17 for him. And so there's now 2 different endings, kind of like those kids' books you used to read and pick. And I wonder, how do you feel about that in terms of the piracy, but also, again, the creativity that comes from somebody writing stuff and having parallel writings? What you publish online can be very different from what is ultimately published in China in written form or in book form.
For myself or for in general?
Both. General first.
It's very interesting. I don't know, James, how much you read the online Chinese communities. They publish things all the time. A lot of materials are created. Almost all the books are created online before they are in print. So to give you one example, there's this woman my age, and she used to live in California, I think, and her husband used to work for the Silicon Valley, and then they moved to Singapore. I think she was a nanny in Singapore, and she had nothing else to do, so she started to write about this love story, really funny, humor, full of humor, love story about her father and her mother, and it got so popular on the internet, and then it was printed, published as a book, and it probably sold like 200,000 copies, or even more than that. And then all of a sudden, she became the hottest screenwriter in China. And now she has made a huge amount of money just writing screenplays for all these TV industry. It's very interesting. But I thought she has lost her original touch when she wrote that first book on the internet, because she had no thought about anything but just to entertain the people who read her on the internet.
I think that's happened a lot with authors where they have said they've been successful. They've written creatively in microblogs and been picked up, and then they start to self-censor. So one of my questions for both of you is, there's obviously microblogging has wonderful effects, but when authors start to self-censor as opposed to just being censored, how much does that affect writing, and how much psychological damage do you think that does?
I'll start with Jim.
I can talk only about the nonfiction world, the world I've seen of Chinese academics and journalists, the people in China who feel they want to operate inside China, and the people who would be my counterparts in China. They want to be involved in the work of their country. And it's a really fascinating path that they walk. I find myself dividing them into sort of two categories. People I don't despise, but I sort of look down on, and people I really respect. The ones I despise or look down on are the ones who just decide they're going to stay with the system and take the red envelope payments, you know, the sort of the payment that you get when you write a story on any politician or corporation. So there's corrupt journalism of the most kind of venal sort, and intellectuals who are kind of grind out agitprop in the same way. And then there are people, I think especially a lot of Chinese journalists, who are braver than any Western journalists have to be. I mean, I always knew the worst thing that could happen to me in China is that I'd have to leave. That's, as a U.S. citizen, that really is sort of the end of what's of the danger scale. But for Chinese journalists, that they really have danger of being imprisoned and worse. And so I admire their ingenuity of deciding every day how far they can go. And to give you an illustration of that, in the past year, there's been a horrible pollution epidemic in Beijing. It's just been worse than ever before. And until 2 or 3 years ago, people couldn't describe that journalistically. But the journalists have now been able they've been allowed to write about environmental problems, worker safety problems, some local corruption problems, as long as it's seen as an aberration and not as something that's typical of larger government practices. So what I have seen is people trying to use the available territory and expand it. And that's a kind of creativity and principle that I respect.
That's interesting. You know, just speaking from the fiction point of view, I met this young woman in Ireland, and she's a fiction writer. And she writes in Chinese, and I read her Chinese novels, and I wasn't really impressed. Quite fluffy, I think. She also wrote for a TV industry. But she's very interesting. She told me, she said all the writing she wants to do, she actually writes them, but she cannot publish them. So she said, you know, these things are just for making money. And she said, I really admire you because you can write in English, and then you don't have to censor yourself, which is true, because I guess one big reason that I choose to write in English is I don't have to censor myself, or I don't allow my country to censor me. But for her, I think she's very interested. She's very pessimistic. She said there's no way this writing would ever be, you know, in print, but she has to write them to sort of to keep herself going, to write other stuff. And I find that very interesting.
And a policy point I would make here, if I can't resist, I'm a journalist for the Atlantic. If I were charged with the future of China, I would really feel terrible hearing something like the last 30 seconds. Oh. If you have somebody who is a very talented writer who feels that she can't do her best work in her own language in her own country, she has to go someplace else. Same thing true for academics, for many scientists. I know an innovator, an entrepreneur in Shanghai who, for his new company, he felt he had to incorporate it in Palo Alto to protect himself from intellectual property theft. And so if you have a country full of talented people, and some of the very best ones feel they can't do their work there, that is a real problem for the country.
It is, yes.
Yeah.
Mui Rong, again, a Chinese author was talking about, for him, that he said he'd think of a sentence and realize it would get deleted, so he would delete it himself. So when I talk about self-censorship, what you're talking about is really invasive with some of the great authors that are coming out of China and being translated.
It is, and the other thing also, I think it really greatly influences Chinese literature or affects Chinese literature is, you know, magic realism. I have so much to say against Chinese magic realism, but then again, maybe that's their only choice.
Yeah.
I had this talk with Yan Lianke, you know, a couple months ago when he was shortlisted for Man Booker. So I asked him, I said, you know, what do you think? He said, the most important thing for Chinese writers is to get rid of the magic realism. But he said, but nobody can at this moment. So he gave the example, I'm sure you know those like 10,000 pigs in Huangpu River.
Yep.
So there was
Yes.
this was a very Chinese story. So one day people woke up and see 10,000 dead pigs.
And that became 19,000, but
That's right, floating in Huangpu River. And so the government first said, oh, this is not harmful to people's health.
where the drinking water comes
The
out.
drinking water. And then a few days later, I think they gave the explanation, these pigs, it was too cold, so these pigs were frozen to death. Again, it was very funny, but the thing to me interesting is he said most Chinese writers or even Chinese readers of the newspapers, they would not care the real explanation because they knew or they know there's corruption involved in that case and they don't want to know the rest of the story. And he said the writers, if they write the story, they would use magic realism, seeing all these pigs floating around. But that's not the root of the problem sometimes.
Right.
The pig story, we were in Shanghai during the pig story. That was a great moment. There became online jokes that the pigs had decided to commit suicide rather than breathe the air. And then there was the nationalists were saying it was all from American genetically modified feed. And then somebody was saying this actually was a good sign because what it showed was that the food inspection system had gotten better. And these were pigs that had, pigs always die, and these were pigs that previously would have been just sent right into the slaughterhouse, into the meat supply. And so now they are cleaning up the meat inspection system, so the farmers had to just get rid of the pigs someplace. So there.
So let the pigs float away.
You brought up Jan Lianke, and he's kind of been fascinating lately and called out Mo Yan and been pretty critical of some of the intelligentsia.
Yeah.
What do you think about what he's saying with all, Chinese writers shirking their responsibilities? And do you think that writers have a duty or responsibility to oppose censorship?
That's a very good question. I mean, I guess his criticism of Mo Yan is he's taking up so much of the party, language, and he's serving as part of the propaganda system. And personally, I don't think a writer, I think a writer's, responsibility is to the writer and to the readers, rather than, being a representative of some ideology. But then I can't stop agreeing with Yan Lianke because I really think Mo Yan is behaving rather terribly.
He's really defending a lot.
He's defending, and one thing I thought was fascinating, Yan Lianke said, in March when the National Congress was, having a meeting, and Mo Yan went there, and all these reporters, it was fascinating if you read Chinese newspapers, they would show all these young women reporters, crowding onto him, and he fell down. He's an older man, so he fell down onto the ground. And it was a big headline saying, Mo Yan was, attacked by these women reporters, and he fell down. And Yan Lianke said, why would he have to go there? He isn't, he can have an excuse. He can say, I'm not healthy, or I have, he has many excuses not to be there, but he wants to be there. That's Yan Lianke's criticism of him.
How do you feel, since you are a fiction writer, obviously the journal is different, but how do you feel when you're asked to make public statements about politics in China? I mean, it's completely different from what your work is.
I never do give a public statement. I would give stories.
Okay.
I can only tell stories.
I wanted to talk about microblogging a little bit more. It seems like it's huge, obviously, in China, and it's really allowed the spread of news and views in ways that previously were not possible. And I think what you were mentioning about some of the things, and civic-minded bloggers have millions of followers and are actually able to address food and safety and pollution problems. So it seems like perhaps microblogging can influence or change policy. Do you agree? Do you think it's working?
It certainly can, and the ways in which it can influence, I think, are changing day by day and still to be determined. Like everything in China, there is scale to the Chinese microblog world that there is in the rest of the world. I think I have never posted anything on my Weibo account, but I have like 10 times more followers there than on Twitter, and because there's just lots of everything there. And I think that I was impressed that a reassuring thing in trying to write about China as an outsider is that anything you say is true somewhere in China. And so that's also true, and I think in this microblog world, there's things that are accurate and are real sort of consciences of the nation. There are things that are crazy and hysterical, and things that are nationalistic and paranoid, and things that are victimizing certain people. There's the so-called human flesh search engine where you kind of deputize people to go find miscreants and hound them to death sometimes. I think it is. I'll make one other point about it, that it's an interesting phenomenon about China that we were struck on when we first moved there in 2006, is that while many infrastructure, while in general it's a poorer country than the U.S., phone communication is much more advanced. Any beggar you see will have a cell phone. It's nearly universal cell phone coverage, and there's no place in the country you can't get a signal. My phone doesn't work here in Aspen, but when I was inside coal mines, my Chinese cell phones always worked. And I think that the result is there's a kind of real-time nervous system that connects everybody for better and for worse. And interestingly, there was a study I think from the Berkman Center a week or two ago, trying to see where are the patterns of censorship of microblog and cell phone activity, showing that there's much less censorship of political criticism than there is of anything that involves organization. If there's anything where you're going to get people together, that is the government's real concern, is organized opposition of any kind, more even than criticism.
Interesting. Yeah, because I think you're right, because everything in China is really the information goes as it happens. I have seen, even from living in California, you could see if there's a murder case in a college, 2 minutes later, the whole country knows somebody is murdered in this college, and then the college or the university would shut down the news, and they would shut down the communication. But already the news is out to the world.
Yeah. Do you think on some of these public policy changes that are occurring because of microblogging, as a journalist, are we just in the Western press hearing aberrations, or is this becoming really pervasive?
I think that a struggle for all Westerners trying to render trends in China to the outside world is even more than any place else. You're seeing 1/1,000,000th of reality any given moment. You try to put it in perspective. Let me make one other point that then answer your question directly. I think the reporters for the New York Times, I think the Western press corps in China is really excellent now. I think the combination of the professional reporters and these bloggers all over the hinterland, I think they're doing a good job. I think the reporters for the New York Times have an impossible job because the Chinese government thinks they are part of the U.S. government and treats them that way. And the Chinese government has this, the people who have the most influence over how China is seen in the outside world, that is the New York Times Bureau. They are the foreigners treated worst of anybody, and all the foreigners in China. This is the kind of clever PR genius of the Chinese government. And so, therefore, they end up feeling as if they have to report all incidents of political persecution, all the corruption and things like that. So things which might in reality be 10% of what's going on in China are 50% of the coverage coming out of there because they feel honor bound to commit those things. So this is a way of saying, anything you report out of China is by definition aberrational because it's so huge and sprawling, and all we can hope is that an accumulation of more and more coverage will sort of average out and people will get an idea.
Yes, it's very interesting because I read the New York Times coverage of China all the time, and I find it fascinating in a way. I think also for overseas Chinese, that's one thing like overseas Chinese community reacts very strongly about is it the real China we're seeing, or this is not a China we know, or we're seeing so.
And the Chinese government will not give, this is an amazing sort of tin horn thing, they won't give visas to New York Times reporters now, so the current reporters in China for the New York Times, their time is up. They'd like to go home, but they can't leave because their replacements can't come, which is a really sort of third-rate thing for a country to do. And I was one of a number of journalists signing a letter just yesterday to the State Department of the U.S. saying the U.S. should apply reciprocal pressure. Just say we're not going to give any more visas to Chinese journalists until they change this policy.
That's interesting. Who would make that policy? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm just speaking of policy making.
Yeah,
It's
but
just
you know,
very
the
true.
propaganda bureau or whatever, the state security.
But who are these people? Have you met these people?
I met some of them.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm always curious how their minds work.
Well, actually, yeah, I was saying about 3 weeks ago, I was in Beijing in this meeting with American former retired generals plus me and Chinese PLA generals. It was really fascinating. And I think the main explanation, the way I can sort of capture this mindset for myself is to think, after all, the United States has Dick Cheney. And so the Dick Cheney mentality applied in China, you know, is what you see there. And I think it's based on a deep mistrust of what the U.S. finally intends towards China, and whether the U.S. finally is scheming for China's downfall, which I think is not U.S. policy and has not been, but they don't believe it.
That's always the case. I
Yeah.
think even when I was in school, you know, I think with everything we learned, there was this sentence, you know, America has never given up their scheme in toppling our country or in destroying us. You know, it's just always that sentence again and again.
Which is the opposite of U.S. policy, but again, that's easy for me to say and hard for a PLA general to believe.
I wanted to ask you about, it's obvious that the Chinese government knows people get around the censorship and monitoring, and they're able to access different things. So why is there, and especially with the upper classes and intelligentsia, people can access. So what's the point of maintaining this firewall? It's so costly, too.
My theory is that, so I had a theory as of about 3 years ago, now I have a new theory. My theory as of 3 years ago is then you had this sort of casual firewall, where if you were living in Beijing, you could get around it, I could get around it, and professors at Tsinghua could get around it. But for most people in China, it wasn't worth the bother. It wasn't worth the $10 a month. It wasn't worth to see things in English or whatever. And so it controlled most of the people. You know, for 95% of the people, you could sort of buffer what they knew, and the other 5% they didn't care about. Now, I think they are being more thoroughgoing and tight on it, I think as a sign of greater just sort of security state concern. And I think there's a genuine debate inside the Chinese government about how concerned they need to be about sort of social stability and all the rest. From the outside, it looks like they're riding high and have no problems, but I think there's more. So I think it's worth it just because it's giving up anything is worth it for retaining control.
I have a question for you. We talked about a little bit earlier on privacy.
Yes.
We're talking about censorship and privacy. When you're growing up in China, I read in one of your interviews that the concept of privacy in China wasn't really present. How did that affect you as a child and now as a writer?
Yes, so when I grew up, I remember my mother always had this saying. I think she still believes, strongly in it. That if you have anything to hide, that means you have something ugly to hide. So there's, so she was very strong about you have to open your whole life to people. People should come in and see how you live. People should not have to call. I mean, we didn't even have telephone at the time, but people should just knock on your door and come in and see, how your life is. So privacy, in a way, I think part of it indicates guilt, something you have done wrong. And part of it's shame. If you have some sort of privacy, that's something shameful. So that's a concept that's not there. When I grew up, was not there. But I want to go back to what James said about, the Flash search engine. So I don't know if you've heard of it.
Explaining that.
So the human flash search engine. So to give you an example, a few years ago, there was this young woman who mistreated a cat. Mm-hmm. I mean, she put on YouTube, I guess she abused a little cat. And she put on YouTube, 5 minutes later, people all over the country started to search her. And they called it human flash search engine. It was so powerful. Right away, they located her. They located her name, her profession, and everything. The whole country would know her. And there was no privacy there. And even worse, I think, that the same thing, the human flash search engine, also is present in overseas Chinese community, which to me is very interesting. These are the people, Chinese people, who have come to America, like me, who live like Americans. But then I think many cases, there was this case very near me in California, a couple, and the other couple, I think there was an affair, one husband and they had an affair with another, with the wife. And again, people all of a sudden became so excited. Let's use the human search engine, human flash search engine. And within a day, all 4 names and their professions, they all work in Silicon Valley. Their jobs, their job status, everything was on the internet.
Wow.
And so that is scary. That's the privacy that I always, I'm scared about that. So I think, as a writer, in a way, I think I'm always very protective of my privacy in that way, because I don't want my life to be there. I don't want my work to be read in that way. So.
And there's, I think also, from an outsider's perspective, living in China just for reasons of density, there's less personal space. You can be a hermit up in Colorado and never see anybody. If you're on the street in Shanghai, you're sort of walking around in your pajamas, and it's a sort of public communal family life in a way that has not been so much the case in the West.
Yes. I wanted to talk about banned books. An issue around the world. Banned books. What is interesting is when a label or a book gets banned in China, even if it's not very literary and doesn't really have much merit, it gets often picked up by a Western publisher. And so I guess my question to you as a writer is, does that disappoint you that we're only seeing a few of these books come out that often are just sexual content or not meritorious? Yeah. Or do you think there's a bigger problem with banned books both ways?
I think to me, I think I have seen a lot of translations of Chinese novels, into English. They always have this, this disclaimer, it's banned in China. Sometimes it's not true. These books are readily available to Chinese audience. Maybe it's banned for one day, or for one city, or it's never. I don't think all these banned books in English, they're never really banned in Chinese. They have all been read in China, I would say, before they were translated into English. Even Yan Lianke, when I talked to him, his books were, I think his publisher said, his books were banned in China. And I asked him about it. He said, it's really not banned. It's really just one army general looked at it and said, oh, this is really terrible. That's just one person or, one powerful person said that, but they banned probably for, the books was banned probably just for a couple months and it was out. So I think it serves the purpose of, marketing. American audience would say, oh, this is a book banned in China. It must have some, intrinsic merit, which is actually not very true.
Especially with certain genres, which we discussed.
Yes.
We can't name names.
And it'd be an illustration, the famous biography of Mao that came out a couple of years ago, this giant fat one, I think that actually was banned. It was published in Hong Kong.
That was banned, yeah.
But there was so my latest book, China Airborne, which is the official Chinese version is coming out now, and the house that's doing it in China said they're trying to have this classified as a technical book as opposed to a political book, because then what they want is for the censors in their house not to even look at it. Because if they looked at it, then there's a lot they would have to remove. So it would be banned in China if they notice it, but otherwise it can just sort of sneak under.
But are your English books sold in China?
Well, the first time I was in China in 1986, I was going to visit the Defense Ministry, and I was presented then with this lovely leather-bound, sort of gold-etched copy of my book, National Defense. They translated into Chinese without my knowledge and given to all their. So there was. I think some of my books have been translated into Chinese, but just sort of on the samizdat.
Okay.
Not officially.
All publishers in China are required to be licensed by the General Administration of Press and Publication. But I was reading that that agency has the power to deny people the right to publish, to shut down any publisher immediately overnight. But as a result of that, there are supposedly over 4,000 underground publishing factories. So I find that kind of interesting of what's going on and how the internet and the microblogging, these independent underground publishers are picking up more stuff. So there may be more publishing as a result of censorship.
Yeah.
What do you
That's
think?
interesting because one person in China once wrote me, and she actually was very angry about me. And she said, why, I mean, she was very interesting. She said, why are you so famous in China, in America? Because your stories, I have known these underground writers who write the exact stories in Chinese that they cannot get published. And I thought, that's exactly the problem. They need publishers. And so I think she mentioned there are a group of writers in Nanjing who write underground literature, and apparently she was able to access to. So I'm sure there were underground publishers publishing this literature. Yeah.
And my own journalistic point here would be that on the one hand, you see this fantastic creativity and ingenuity at the personal level, the village level, the family level, people finding ways to get around, to make their way around often impeding structures. And that's something I always loved about China. And so you have the coexistence of ferociously and just admirably ingenious people and a system that makes it difficult to sort of channel some of that into larger national good, whether at the university level or the corporate level or the national literary level or whatever. So really ingenious people in a system that makes it hard to take advantage of that in the largest way, in the best ways.
I have a question for you, James. The internet blocking, I think you have argued, serves as a trade barrier. How much economic harm do you think the filtering and censorship cause to America?
I think that there is there's significant harm of a different kind. Well, there's I would say three answers. The internet companies, starting with Google, would argue persuasively that they've been really damaged by the Chinese internet regime. Google, the only place in the world where Google is not strong is China, and they're on a downward trajectory there. The biggest and fastest growing market for mobile apps, they don't have any presence there because they decided, I think admirably, to take on the Chinese government directly, and they're just being made to pay. So I think internet companies per se, they are hurt by this as a trade barrier. Second answer would be the companies that are really, when GE or Pfizer or these companies say that their trade secrets are being taken, that's true. And I think that the U.S. has a legitimate beef in saying that that internet hacking comes from all over the world, and the U.S. is very aggressive in its internet surveillance, as we know. What's unique about the Chinese situation now is state-directed corporate sort of theft, and so that is what the U.S. is acting to stop there. The third answer I'd give is that the real commercial harm in the long run, I think, of internet censorship is to China. They're not going to have their own Harvard or Yale. They're not going to have their own Google. They're not going to have their own world-leading writers as long as the main communication tool of this era is censored. So that would be my answer.
I have to open it up for questions, but I have one last thing I think we have to mention in light of the debate currently in America. What do you think of Snowden?
So I will say, I think that I am agnostic about Snowden himself. I don't know enough about him, but I think this is in the category of leaks that do more good than harm. And I would distinguish it this way. The leaks that do more harm than good are short-term operational intelligence. I think that the WikiLeaks in general did more harm than good, because lots of people were just exposed in China, in all sorts of places, and they were arrested and they were killed and all the rest, and that did a lot of harm. I think that this, from what I can tell, the harm of this revelation was relatively minor, because terrorist groups already knew they shouldn't use cell phones. That's why Osama bin Laden lived in his place. And the good it did in forcing a debate, I think it did more harm than good. I don't know what to make of this guy.
And Yiyun, what do you think about him fleeing to Hong Kong? Beijing has, eroding some of the freedoms in Hong Kong over the last
I find that
years.
fascinating. Again, I don't know him enough. I have followed the news. And two things, I think. One was maybe just coming from China. The things as they happened was not a surprise to me. And actually, I went back to to read Seneca to explain it to myself. As you know, Seneca said, "I don't know what it's going to happen, but I know what's capable of happening." And I always think, that's a good way to look at the world. It may not happen, but it's capable of happening. We don't think the American government will do these things, but it's actually capable, and the government is capable. So in that sense, I don't think it's a surprise. I was very surprised he fled to Hong Kong.
Yeah.
I don't know how to make it.
And I think that was naive more than conniving in some way.
Right.
But who knows?
And again, from a fiction writer's point of view, I think he would be an interesting character, full of conflicts, and also just flaws, and also inexplicable. You cannot explain anything. So I find him fascinating.
So that's your next book, right?
Yes, I'm going to write about him.
Let's take some questions. I think we have a couple microphones. Who has a question? Down here, please. Yes, please.
I think for recording purposes.
Thank you. I found that very interesting. The question I have has to do with the issue of self-censorship, which is something that both of you brought up, and it brings to mind the following. The Financial Times, about a year ago, had a big article on Bob Dylan not being allowed to sing in China. And the issue was why. And in the end, Bob Dylan, after, and I don't know all the intricacies of the interactions they had, but in the end he sang, and per the publicist for Bob Dylan, he never had to give them a list of the songs he wouldn't sing, but he didn't even sing Blowin' in the Wind. He didn't sing anything that had any kind of an anti-establishment overtone. And I think it just highlights, this was on the front page of the Financial Times with a big picture of Bob. And it truly highlights the issue of self-censorship, because Dylan didn't bring up or sing any of the songs that had made him famous.
This is something I actually spent a lot of time on, and the consensus in the Westerners in China is that the FT really got that wrong. And because what happened is Bob Dylan, part of the point of principle is he never gives a song list ever. This is part of his style. And many of the songs that he sang actually were much more challenging than Blowing in the Wind. He didn't sing the songs that were famous to us, but he sang a lot of his later songs, which are very Christian and are very sort of challenging to the state. And so the sort of the view by the people I believed is that this was the FT guy just didn't understand this. And he was saying, the FT guy said, the song that's famous to me, he didn't sing, but actually the ones Dylan sang had more resonance with the audience in China. But I agree that, in general, I agree with you, this particular point got my attention, or this particular story is one I'd paid attention to.
We have another question over here, and then the next one at this table here, please.
Two questions. Yiyun, are your books translated and published in Taiwan?
No, my books are not translated into Chinese per my choice, actually.
Oh, okay.
I have been approached by Chinese publishers, and my answer is no, I'm not ready. And sometimes it's not, I think it's both ways. I don't think the country is ready, and neither am I ready for the country to read me. So I'm saying I'm waiting for the time that I feel ready.
Okay, thank you. The other one is, how are underground published books distributed?
That I don't know. Oh, I can give you an example. This is only one example. A friend of mine is a leading lesbian activist in Beijing, and she started the first organization in Beijing, and lesbian and rights, and they published their own magazine, a monthly magazine, I think. But it's beautifully printed and everything, but they only give to people they know. So it's distributed by I guess, just to a group of people they trust. Even then, I think they organized a couple events, and both events, the policemen showed up and just break down the gatherings. Yeah.
I think we had a question there.
I was wondering if how the students in the universities and schools of journalism and communications react to all that. Do they have to, does the teaching change every year, and how do they deal with this?
I think it's a highly diverse situation. I've actually been to a lot of Chinese universities, including some journalism schools, and there's a big range. There are people, and like many things in China, the easiest matrix is often geographical. The closer you are to Beijing, the less latitude you have. And I think it's no coincidence that there's a law school. The best journalism school and I think the best law school in China are both in Shenzhen, just as far as you can possibly be away from Beijing within the confines. And I think there are pockets of, when I talk to university students, I'm impressed by the range of great worldliness and sophistication on many points. Again, last month, we were in Renmin University in Beijing talking with them about Taiwan. There are a number of students from Xiamen, which is sort of the coastal area closest to Taiwan. They watch Taiwanese TV all the time. Say, yeah, we can tell these people are just different from us. We're never going to get together. And they were very, very different from the official line. But other people might say, oh yes, this is of crucial importance to our motherland. So I think there are huge variabilities in what people know, what they've been able to search out, and the journalists some of them are really principled and really trying to do their best, and others are just careerists.
We have a couple. Let's take one back there, the gentleman in the back, and then the next question. Actually, you had your hand up too. This gentleman over here, please. Go ahead.
Thank you. Your comments were mostly focused on the extent to which the Great Firewall curtails the dissemination of ideas. And I'm wondering if you could comment on the extent to which they use the same techniques to create a new narrative or a false narrative on issues that have great political sensitivity. And two issues that come to mind would be the current view, which is so widespread within China, that the Tibet independent movement has no bearing of any legitimacy. And the second related issue, or maybe perhaps not related, is the extent to which they have created the narrative of why Japan is kind of the leading bad actor in today's world.
We may have interestingly complementary views on these, but go ahead.
I have things to say about both, I guess. Tibet, it's very interesting. I could tell you the personal experience was when I grew up, there was, even when I left the country, I left the country around 96, there was no sense of, Tibetan, Tibet was a different country. To us, it was just, we were brought up to believe it's part of China, and we never really doubted about it. We never really questioned about it. So I started to look at the situation just after I came to after I left China. But even, that's because I had access to the knowledge, to the information, and to different narrative, as you said. I think, within China, the narrative was still very strong. Even within overseas Chinese community, the narrative, the belief is very strong that Tibetan, was part of our history, and they would give you all these historical facts, which to me, again, I don't understand I guess what I don't understand is overseas Chinese, when you have the access to the information, why you can't use your own brains to analyze the situation. But then, I don't think you can change that in China.
I will say, I've emphasized the variability of everything in China, with this exception. Deb and I, over the years, we have not met a single person in China who had what you'd think of as the outside world's view of Tibet. It all is, and those who are aware of the outside world view might say, well, do you think that Arizona is actually part of the United States? Do you think Hawaii is part of the United States? And there are some historical parallels. So this is something where I think even before the internet, this is the view in China.
And And also, I think this is one topic that even if you go onto the internet community in U.S., the Chinese internet community in U.S., it's one topic that make people fight all the time. But I think most people, I think, still so strongly believe Tibet is part of China.
There's the next time any of you go to Beijing, you should go to the Cultural Palace of the Minorities, where they have an exhibit on Tibetan history, and it's the tragic past of serfdom. And they have all these pictures of peasants being tortured by the monks. They have a flayed skin, allegedly from some peasant who was skinned alive by the monks. And then it's happy times under liberation. And and the big picture there is a woman opening a giant fridge of Qingdao beer. And it's worth going to see.
It's really the narrative we were taught. In Japan, what do you think? Japan. He also asked.
So when we first went to China in '86, we were living in Japan, and from that time to this, the level of anti-Japanese hostility is much higher than it was before. And I think, and you turn on TV any night, there's some World War II drama, and to the extent it's often become, some of the internet community is now making fun of this. It's just so there's been a deliberate campaign to vilify, to ratchet up this anti-Japanese feeling. As an American, I often secretly thought, thank God it's not us. But it's bad towards Japan, and I think that it's. So how do you view this?
To me, it's interesting as I would say this. My family, my great-grandfather was killed by Japanese army, stabbed to death. And so I had this whole family history, when Japanese army invaded China, all these tragedies. But to me, I think what's interesting to me is how one country decides not to forget about one part of history while we selectively forget about the communist history or the Cultural Revolution. I think that tells so much about, we have to make we have to, choose certain people as villains. Well, we cannot self-reflect. And I think self-reflection is one big thing about how mature a country can be. And I think as a nation, I don't think China is mature enough to self-reflect. So Japan is an easy target. It's always there. The history is always there.
And the Japanese have not been great in the way they handle World War II history, too. Our kids were in Japanese public school. We lived there. And one of our sons was in the world history class for the timeline of the 20th century. It sort of got hazy around 1935, and it resumed again in 1945 with the atomic bomb. That was the meaning of that era, was Japan suffering, which was true but partial.
We had a question here with this gentleman. Okay, we have one here at the front table.
With all the oppression and control, how did you and other people in China develop an inquisitive mind?
That's a very interesting question. I think, how do you, my easiest answer is, it's like a child growing up. Whatever your parents tell you not to do, you have to do it. And for me, as my parents, brought me up as a very obedient citizen. And of course, I would question anything and everything. But later I realized, my parents, after I grew up, I realized they also started to question much more than before. And I think my mother is a very interesting situation. My mother's whole family fought against communism in Civil War. So you would think she would have the most rebellious mind, and her brother went to Taiwan, and her father and her other brother were, experienced great difficulties throughout Chinese, communism. But she actually had this really strong, naive belief in communism for many years. She thought, people were just wonderful, and China was just wonderful. And now she's just started to realize it was not like that. So I benefited from her belief, because if she believed in that, I have to question that.
I think we have time for one final question. And I saw this first hand right here. Thank you.
I wonder if any one of you know about this BlackRock grant to Tsinghua University to set up the Rhodes Scholarship. And I wonder what
editorial in the New York Times from Yu Hua that thought that it was, what's there to teach? What are your feelings about it? Is it just a gimmicky, or is it going to help the relationship, or are we going to be able to really send wonderful minds over there and really learn about China?
So the background on this, Steven Schwarzman, who's a BlackRock guy, a very, very prosperous guy, he was controversial in China as of 5 or 6 years ago because the first big investment the China Investment Corporation had made overseas was into his fund, which then cratered. And so then during the world financial crisis, there were all these editorials in the Chinese press, our grandmothers starved so we could give our money to this guy, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's been on his mind to do things to solidify the relationship. That's one thing. Second, he may, then there's the model of the Rhodes Scholarships. I should disclose here, I had a Rhodes Scholarship to go to England, and I knew that part of the idea there was an English, the Cecil Rhodes idea was to habituate the people from all the former empire to the ways of the motherland. It didn't really work that way because many people, including me, who were there thought, well, why are these people all so high and mighty towards us? I ended my 2 years in England thinking America's best war was the Revolutionary War, and which gave us freedom from the Queen and all the rest. But still, there was the Rhodes idea that certainly Oxford was the pinnacle of world education, et cetera, and I think it had some effect in trying to tie and some international elite together. I think the idea of doing this for Chinese universities would be to appeal to their grand idea of sort of reaching world leadership. I don't think that's realistic because Chinese universities honestly are not very good yet because they're operating in these conditions of censorship. But from my point of view, anything that gets more people into China is good. Anything that gets more people having firsthand experience with China is to the good for China and for those people for the rest of their life. So I'm for it. How about you?
I think it's very interesting because from what I read, in Chinese newspaper, not like official newspapers, but just commentaries, they compare this to the fellowship, the Gengzi Peikuan, which was, after what's the war? The 1900.
From World War I?
No, before World War I. The kind of
Boxer Rebellion?
Yes,
Yeah.
Boxer.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. My history, right?
1911.
The Boxer
Oh, yeah.
Rebellion. After Boxer Rebellion, American and the Western country, the Tsinghua University was established by that money. The Western country, Western world put the money into China to establish this university. So they compared this to that.
Yeah.
And I agree. I actually, just from my personal experience, I went to Peking University, and when I was in the university, there were not many American visitors, but whoever was visiting always brought things to us. I remember this teacher who taught American cultural history, and I took the course. It was all about 1960s and feminism, all these things that you never learn in China. It was fascinating to me. It was eye-opening to me too. And I just imagined all these young people from America going to China. They're going to communicate.
And if I could say one other thing about the Boxer Rebellion, which I think was so interesting and many Americans don't appreciate. It was American money that set up Tsinghua and some others, but it was after there were reparations ordered from China by the other European countries, and China had to pay, but the U.S. said, okay, our reparations we'll use to set up these universities. And many people in China are aware of that. Nobody in the U.S. knows that, but it's an important sort of goodwill aspect between the U.S. and China.
That's exactly right. Isn't that interesting? That part was forgotten.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much. I do want to say, yes, thank you. There are books, and both of our authors will do book signings out front, and I so appreciate you being here
Thank
today.
you so much.
Thank you, Melissa.